Welcome to a world where ancient legends intertwine with reality, and where one wrong move can turn a person to stone. Jack Rivers stood at the entrance of an ancient temple, feeling a cold wind cut straight through him. The letter from Professor Mara Hale, with its image of Medusa and a short line "She has awakened," offered him no peace. Everything he knew about myths suddenly became a tangible threat. Professor Mara met him at the temple entrance. Her eyes were strained, but full of resolve. She led Jack down a narrow passage, its walls covered with strange drawings and inscriptions in ancient Greek. The images of Medusa didn't just show her appearance, they depicted her victims, turned to stone, with eyes that seemed to follow every movement. Inside the temple, the air was thick, as if darkness itself was gathering around them. Jack could almost feel the gaze of an invisible presence, and every sound seemed amplified. The first sign of danger appeared when a tourist, who had accidentally wandered into the temple, froze and became a stone figure, as if horror had instantly solidified his body. Jack froze, feeling a cold terror, but Mara managed to calm him with a gesture, explaining that they had to act quickly, or the curse would consume them too. They began to explore the temple. Every room held a trap, statues changed position, walls shifted, and illusions provoked doubt in their own senses. Sometimes Jack saw his reflection in dark surfaces, but it moved differently than he did. Mara explained, "The eye of the curse not only turns the body to stone, it distorts the mind, making you doubt reality." Deep inside the temple, they found an ancient scroll with instructions on how to neutralize Medusa. They had to use reflective surfaces so that her gaze would reflect back onto her, creating a closed-loop effect. This required precision and courage. One wrong step and they would become stone themselves. As they moved forward, the temple seemed to come alive. Stone guardians, covered in moss and cracks, began to move, and the corridors filled with whispers that tried to confuse them. Jack and Mara stayed together. Every step was calculated, every movement carefully measured. They understood that their opponent was not just physical, but psychological. Finally, they reached the central chamber. Before them stood a massive marble statue of Medusa. Her eyes began to glow with a green light that penetrated to the very core. Jack set up mirrors to reflect the light, creating a labyrinth of reflections, while Mara chanted spells that slowed her movements. Medusa lunged desperately, but each of her gazes was reflected back, intensifying her own curse. With every second, the pressure increased. The temple walls shook, and the stone guardians tried to stop them. Jack felt his fear growing, but he controlled his breathing, focusing on the mirrors. Mara whispered incantations, and the light from the mirrors began to compress Medusa's form, creating an effect of internal destruction. The moment the statue cracked, the temple began to collapse. Stone slabs fell around them, but they managed to run to the exit. Outside, they were met by the sunrise, and the first sunlight reflected off the mirror fragments. Jack and Mara stood on a cliff, realizing they had survived, but they also knew that myths don't disappear. They only hide, waiting to emerge again. After they returned to the city, Professor Mara made a decision. All records of the temple and the eye of the curse would be hidden. Jack felt relieved, but the unease didn't leave him. He understood that this case was just the beginning. The world still held many artifacts, and many of them could be far more dangerous. They stood in silence, watching the horizon. The wind carried the scent of the sea and ancient earth, reminding them that history continues to live on. Inside Jack, an understanding took root. The fight against myths is not just scientific work, but a constant test of courage and sanity. He turned to Mara and said one word: "Ready." She nodded, and they knew that even more mysteries awaited them. But now they were together, armed with knowledge and resolve. The world around them seemed calm, but somewhere in the shadows, in forgotten temples and dungeons, ancient entities were waiting, and anyone who dares to look them in the eye might become part of the curse. Jack and Mara knew this and understood that their mission was only just beginning. The Medusa curse, a lingering threat. Temple was behind them, but the sense of threat lingered, clinging to Jack and Mara. They returned to the city, but the streets seemed strangely empty, as if darkness itself watched their every step. Mara was checking ancient records, trying to determine if the remnants of the curse had been completely obliterated. Jack inspected the mirrors they had left in the temple, contemplating how little they truly knew about Medusa's power. That night, they received a strange message in an old attic in the city center. Someone had left a scroll with ancient symbols. Its content was incomplete, but the warning was clear. The eye of the curse has reawakened. Watch for the shadow. Jack felt a chill run down his spine. Even after destroying the central source of Medusa's power, her influence remained in the world. They decided to act immediately. The scroll led them to an abandoned dungeon beneath an old theater. A staircase descended into darkness, and the air there was thick, almost tangible. Inside, they saw the first signs of activity. Statues in the dim light turned towards them, and fresh cracks appeared on the walls, as if the very stone fabric was coming alive. Mara began chanting spells, designed to reveal the curse's weak points. Jack noticed that some of the cracks on the walls formed symbols that echoed those from the ancient ruins. They realized that Medusa was somehow transmitting power through stone and light, using people's fear. Now, they not only had to reflect her gaze, but find a way to destroy the channel of energy transmission. Suddenly, one of the stone guardians animated and lunged from the shadows. Jack barely managed to dodge, and Mara threw a scroll with a spell at it, forcing the statue to freeze in place. But it was only temporary. With each passing minute, the stone figures grew more aggressive, and the dungeon corridors seemed to shift, creating a labyrinth impossible to navigate. They reached the hall with the mirrors they had previously left. Jack realized that the mirrors could now be used differently, to create a trap that wouldn't just reflect Medusa's gaze, but concentrate her power into a single destructive focus. Mara began chanting new spells, activating the energy of the symbols on the walls, and the air on them began to crackle with magic. At that moment, her face appeared not a statue, but Medusa herself, almost transparent, like a ghost. Her eyes glowed green, and every gaze tried to paralyze the mind. Jack held the mirrors to multiply the reflections, creating an effect of internal rupture. Mara whispered incantations, their voices merging into a single stream directed against the entity. Medusa howled, as if the very air shrieked with her, and the space around them began to contract. The stone guardians crumbled into pieces. The corridors collapsed, and Medusa herself slowly dissolved, as if her energy could not withstand the concentrated reflection. When it was all over, Jack and Mara found themselves back on the surface. This time, they knew Medusa's curse could reawaken anywhere, wherever human fear connected with ancient artifacts. Their mission was far from over. They returned to the university city, where they decided to establish a secret research division dedicated to studying mythical threats. Jack focused on archaeology and the traps of ancient temples, while Mara specialized in the magical and psychological aspects of curses. Their alliance grew strong, and their experience with Medusa had forged their sanity and courage. Yet, deep within Jack's mind, a thought lingered. Somewhere in the shadows of the world, ancient entities were waiting. Every myth, every curse could come alive again, and only they, Jack and Mara, knew how to fight it. After the events with the dungeon beneath the theater, Jack and Mara couldn't afford to relax. Even when the city seemed calm, they sensed that the darkness hadn't fully left the world. At the university, they began to systematically organize all their notes on mythical entities and artifacts. But every new discovery brought with it unsettling questions. One night, Jack received a strange notification on an old, secured phone. The message was just one word: harpies. The word appeared on the screen without a source. Mara, checking ancient texts, confirmed harpies in mythology weren't just birds with women's faces. They were creatures capable of influencing the mind and creating illusions through fear and guilt. They weren't confined to one place but operated through noise, wind, and sounds that people mistook for their own thoughts. Their path led them to an old, abandoned factory on the city's outskirts. Jack and Mara noticed that even the lamplight shifted shades, and sounds echoed words they hadn't spoken. The harpies were using the space as a weapon, and the first contact proved nearly fatal. Jack saw a spectral face that tried to make him believe he had already turned to stone. Mara held him back, uttering a protection spell. The light from the lantern reflected in a small mirror, creating a faint shield between them and the entity. The harpies couldn't directly see them in the reflection, giving them a momentary advantage. Jack realized that their previous methods for deflecting the Medusa could be adapted to create a trap where the entity would become entangled in its own illusions. They moved through the factory, where every room was filled with sounds attempting to deceive their senses. Mara whispered incantations while Jack set up mirrors and metallic surfaces, directing the light toward the sources of the sound. The harpies, sensing resistance, intensified their attacks, creating a vortex of illusions where it was impossible to distinguish reality from fabrication. In the climactic room, they found the creature's nest intertwined bones and feathers surrounded by a glowing substance. Jack and Mara understood. They needed to not just reflect the illusions but concentrate them back onto the source. They connected the mirrors, the lantern light, and Mara's spells into a single stream. The harpies howled, their illusions collapsing as the light and magic compressed them in the center of the room, tearing them apart. When it was over, the factory became empty and quiet again. Jack and Mara knew the world wasn't safer, but they had gained another experience. They understood that mythical entities operated through fear and consciousness, meaning their weapons were reason and knowledge. Returning to the university, they began compiling a map of threats. Medusa was only the beginning. Harpies were the next stage. Ahead of them lay sirens, centaurs, cyclops, and other mythical beings lurking in the shadows of the modern world. Every artifact, every legend, could become a deadly trap. And Jack and Mara knew their mission was endless. They prepared for the next step, studying places where the power of myths and human fear intersected. Jack looked at Mara and said, "Every adventure just gets harder." Mara nodded. "And every victory is temporary." From that moment on, their lives turned into a relentless fight against ancient entities, where not only their lives but also the safety of a world unaware of the hidden threats were at stake. After the battle with the harpies, Jack and Mara understood the myths had become closer to the modern world than they could have ever imagined. Every discovery, every artifact, held a threat. Their new assignment began with an anomaly discovered in an abandoned monastery on a mountain north of the city. Locals had been complaining about strange sounds and disappearances. When Jack and Mara arrived, they felt a peculiar shudder in the air. The silence was heavy like a thick fog, and the wind whispered names they didn't know. The monastery was ruined by time, but a stone statue of a centaur stood in the center of the courtyard. Legends claim that centaurs not only possessed strength and agility but also had the ability to manipulate human memory, turning their recollections into traps. Mara explained that centaurs could create illusions of the past, forcing the victim to relive fear and pain. Upon entering, Jack and Mara found the first signs of activity. The floors were covered with patterns that shifted shape as they moved, and the walls seemed to breathe, showing scenes from Jack's and Mara's childhood. Jack almost believed he was seeing his own parents, who had died many years ago. Mara held his hand, reminding him of the present. They moved on, carefully checking every room. In one of them, the centaur appeared in full size. Its eyes glowed with a golden light, and every glance attempted to penetrate their minds, unlocking their deepest fears. Jack raised the mirrors, left over from reflecting Medusa and the harpies. But Mara realized a new strategy was needed. They feed on memory. "Jack, we need to create a trap out of someone else's recollections to divert its power." Mara began chanting spells, conjuring images drawn from ancient chronicles and myths. Jack focused the mirrors, concentrating the light on the centaur, which was drawn into its own illusions. The creature howled as if its reality were crumbling, and the space around them cracked. The stone columns of the monastery began to collapse. But the trap held the centaur in the center until its power weakened. When the centaur vanished, Jack and Mara understood every mythical opponent was not just a physical threat but a psychological one as well. They had to fight their own fear and memories to survive. They left the monastery, noticing the first signs of dawn on the horizon. But the sense of unease did not leave them. Back in the city, they created a new threat map, marking the places where myths manifested most often. Mara stated, "Each new appearance is stronger than the last." Medusa, harpies, the centaur, they're just the beginning. Jack nodded, understanding that sirens, cyclops, dragons, and creatures humanity didn't even suspect awaited them. They decided to act systematically, divide control zones, study ancient texts, collect artifacts, and prepare traps. The world was dangerous, but now they had a strategy. Every new myth became a test of courage, intellect, and trust in one another. And somewhere in the shadows and forgotten temples and mountains, entities watched them. Every action taken by Jack and Mara only pushed the ancient forces toward awakening. But they knew one thing: as long as there was light reflected in the mirrors, and spells cast in time, the myths could be contained. The next target was already waiting: ancient sirens inhabiting an abandoned seaside city, whose song could capture consciousness. Jack and Mara packed their equipment, checked their mirrors and spells, preparing for a new confrontation where every decision would be a matter of life and death. Jack and Mara arrived at the abandoned coastal town just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was thick with salt and decay, carrying faint whispers that seemed to rise from the crumbling buildings. Locals who remained had long abandoned the place, leaving only empty streets and the constant, eerie echo of the sea. This was the hunting ground of the sirens, whose song could enslave the mind and lure the strongest souls to their doom. As they approached the old harbor, Mara warned, "Their power isn't like anything we've faced. Medusa and the harpies preyed on fear, but the sirens feed on desire and obsession. One note from them, and your mind is no longer yours." Jack adjusted the mirrors and reflective surfaces they carried, lining the edges of the dock and nearby buildings. The plan was simple but dangerous: create a network of reflections that could disrupt the sirens' auditory enchantments and redirect their song back to its source. The first sign of danger came from the water. Mist rolled across the docks, thick and almost tactile, and then shapes emerged, half human, half bird, their eyes glimmering with a natural light. The sirens began to sing. The melody was subtle at first, just a whisper carried by the wind, yet it penetrated the mind, twisting memories and desires. Jack stumbled, visions of past regrets filling his consciousness, while Mara's voice cut through, chanting counterspells to anchor him to reality. They moved forward carefully, each step planned. Mara threw stones that reflected in the mirrors, creating bouncing pulses of light that distracted the sirens. Jack, following her lead, adjusted mirrors to form a funnel toward the center of the harbor. The reflections caused the sirens' song to distort, feeding their own power back at them. But the creatures were clever. They changed pitch and rhythm, trying to bypass the mirrors and attack their minds directly. The battle escalated as the mist thickened, forming shapes of people Jack and Mara had lost, each illusion trying to make them stop. Jack gritted his teeth and focused on the mirrors, using them not only as tools of defense but as weapons. Mara's chants became louder, more intricate, creating a protective field that shielded their thoughts from the sirens' seductive harmonies. Finally, they reached the old lighthouse at the end of the harbor, the central anchor of the sirens' power. Mara began a complex ritual, weaving light and sound into a trap. The mirrors reflected both the incoming song and their amplified own force, creating a feedback loop. The sirens screamed, their forms dissolving in the reflected light, pulled into the center of their own power. Waves crashed violently against the harbor, sweeping away the last remnants of their influence. When silence fell, the mist lifted. Jack and Mara stood alone, exhausted but victorious. They realized the sirens' threat had been neutralized for now, but they also knew the world of myth was spreading, touching places where humans had forgotten to fear. Each victory revealed new threats, and each myth they defeated only hinted at greater dangers lurking in shadowed ruins, oceans, and forests. As dawn broke over the harbor, Jack looked at Mara. "This is just the beginning," he said. She nodded, her eyes scanning the horizon where the fog had once swirled. "And we'll be ready. Whatever comes next, we face it together." Somewhere beyond the horizon, unseen and patient, other ancient beings stirred, sensing the humans who had dared to challenge legends. And Jack and Mara knew their journey was far from over. Dragons, cyclops, and creatures older than memory awaited. And every step forward would test their courage, skill, and the fragile strength of the human mind against myth made real. The mountains loomed on the horizon, jagged peaks slicing the sky like the teeth of some colossal predator. Reports from villagers at the foot of the range spoke of earthquakes, strange glowing lights at night, and livestock disappearing without a trace. Mara traced the signs in her ancient texts and whispered to Jack, "A cyclops is awake. Not just a creature of brute force, its mind can sense fear. It haunts not only with strength but by manipulating perception." They approached the foothills at dusk, carrying their usual array of mirrors, reflective surfaces, and Mara's spell scrolls. The earth itself seemed alive, trembling underfoot. Every shadow shifted unnaturally, and distant sounds, low, guttural, almost whispered, echoed through the valley. Jack's instincts told him this was no ordinary predator. This was a force that could turn the mind against itself. The first encounter came sooner than expected. A massive silhouette appeared against the dying light. One eye, enormous and glowing faintly amber, scanned the landscape. The Cyclops roared, a sound that reverberated through the mountains and seemed to resonate inside Jack and Mara's skulls, forcing visions of failure, despair, and doubt into their minds. Jack stumbled, nearly dropping the mirrors, but Mara's hand gripped his arm, anchoring him. "Focus on the reflections," she shouted, "and remember its power comes from what we fear." They moved cautiously, placing mirrors strategically along rocky outcrops. The Cyclops' eye, capable of hypnotic control, scanned constantly, but the mirrors disrupted its gaze, creating a fractured network of images that confused its perception. It swung a massive club, smashing boulders, but each attack was misdirected, striking reflections or empty spaces. Mara began chanting an ancient binding spell, her voice echoing off the cliffs. The words wove around the Cyclops, attempting to tether its mind to a phantom version of itself in the reflections. Jack adjusted the mirrors, creating a concentric pattern, concentrating light and sound into a trap. The Cyclops roared in frustration, thrashing violently, yet its confusion grew. Its single eye darted from reflection to reflection, unable to distinguish reality from illusion. But then the mountain itself responded. Rocks shifted, creating landslides and hidden crevices, forcing Jack and Mara to dodge not only the Cyclops' attacks but the treacherous terrain. Jack realized that brute force alone wouldn't win this fight. They needed precision, timing, and the amplification of Mara's spells through the mirrors. As night fell, Mara intensified the ritual, drawing the Cyclops' attention to the reflected illusions. The creature's roars became cries of confusion, echoing endlessly back to itself. Jack pushed a final reflective panel into place, forming a loop of light and spell work that trapped the Cyclops' gaze within its own perception. Its body trembled, then froze, immobilized. Caught in the spell and reflection network, the mountains went silent. The Cyclops slumped to the ground, neutralized but not destroyed. Jack and Mara knew its mind remained active, waiting, and that other creatures would follow. Every myth they encountered was evolving, learning, and adapting to their methods. As they descended the mountains, the first rays of dawn lit the valley. Villagers peeked from their homes, seeing the massive creature still lying but no longer threatening. Mara looked at Jack and said, "Every step forward teaches us more about them. But there are others older, more dangerous. And they are awake now because humans keep forgetting fear." Jack tightened his grip on the mirrors. "Then we keep moving. We track them before they track us." Far above, in the darkened peaks, distant eyes watched. The Cyclops' awareness remained, and somewhere beyond, creatures older than memory stirred at the ripples caused by Jack and Mara's victories. Their journey had only begun, and every battle would test not only their strength and knowledge but the resilience of the human mind itself. Weeks passed after the Cyclops encounter, but Jack and Mara felt no respite. Reports came from coastal towns hundreds of miles away, fishermen missing, strange whirlpools forming overnight, and a deep, resonant hum that drove animals and some humans mad with fear. Mara's texts identified the threat, a leviathan, an ancient sea serpent, said to manipulate both water and mind. Unlike the sirens, whose power was limited to song, this creature could create physical storms while twisting perceptions, making even the bravest doubt their own senses. They traveled to the northern coast, arriving at a port town abandoned by most of its residents. The waves crashed higher than any storm should allow, and the harbor lights flickered as though resisting some invisible pressure. Jack adjusted the reflective panels along the docks while Mara prepared wards and spell circles on the shoreline. Their plan: use mirrors to confuse the Leviathan's perception and trap its psychic influence while they attempted a physical containment. The first strike came at dusk. A massive shape breached the water, scales glinting in the fading light, eyes glowing a deep green. Its roar shook the cliffs and sent waves crashing onto the docks. Jack and Mara were immediately bombarded by visions, twisting currents that seemed to swallow entire ships, drowned sailors pleading for help, memories of past failures flooding their minds. Mara gripped Jack's arm, chanting a counterspell that anchored their consciousness. Jack directed the mirrors, reflecting moonlight across the harbor to create a pattern that fractured the creature's psychic reach. Each reflection forced the Leviathan to confront distorted versions of itself, weakening its control over the water and minds around it. Mara intensified her spell, weaving the reflections into a network that tethered the creature's awareness to a single point. But Leviathan's power was immense. The harbor trembled as it lashed its tail, tearing docks apart and pulling debris into spirals. Waves rose in impossible formations, and Jack had to balance the mirrors precariously on crumbling piers, all while avoiding the psychic tendrils that sought to drag his thoughts into despair. Mara, chanting faster, drew energy from the storm itself, linking the elements with the mirror's reflections to create a feedback trap. Ours passed in a blur of crashing water, fractured visions, and relentless chants. Finally, the Leviathan's roars turned to guttural, frustrated thrashes. Light from the mirrors bounced across the water, blinding its glowing eyes and forcing it into the heart of the spell's trap. The psychic feedback loop grew intolerable, and the creature retreated into the depths with a final, deafening roar that shook the coastline. The storm collapsed, leaving only the sound of dripping water and the shivering remnants of the docks. Exhausted, Jack and Mara surveyed the damage. The Leviathan was not destroyed. It had simply been contained, weakened, forced to retreat. They knew it would return, perhaps stronger, perhaps in a different form. Mara spoke quietly. Each battle teaches them, just as it teaches us. And the more they learn, the more dangerous they become. Jack nodded, watching the calm sea now betraying no hint of the storm. Then we don't wait. We find them first. Above the horizon, dark shapes shifted beneath the waves, and in distant peaks and forests, the eyes of ancient creatures glimmered. The world of myth was waking. Jack and Mara understood one undeniable truth. Every victory was temporary. Every creature contained only for a moment. And the next challenge would test their minds, their courage, and the fragile balance between human ingenuity and ancient power. Weeks after the Leviathan's retreat, Jack and Mara returned to their base, only to find signs of disruption far beyond what any single creature could cause. Reports flooded in simultaneously. Villagers in the mountains saw Cyclops again. Coastal towns reported sirens' whispers returning. And in distant ruins, tremors suggested that other, older beings were stirring. Mara said nothing at first, scanning maps and texts, her brow furrowed. It's no longer isolated, she murmured. They are converging. The myths. They're coordinating. Jack felt the weight of it immediately. For the first time, he realized that their battles weren't isolated incidents, they were sparks in a much larger pattern. Somewhere, in the unseen corners of the world, creatures older than memory were rising in tandem, testing the limits of human knowledge and resilience. Mara pulled out a series of enchanted mirrors, scrolls, and glyphs, each designed for one type of creature. We'll have to adapt quickly. One trap at a time won't work anymore. They're learning, and they can communicate through their powers. Their first immediate threat came from the forested valleys near the old monastery. Reports of Cyclops and other hulking beings overlapping with phantom sightings made the area uninhabitable. As they arrived, Jack noticed subtle distortions in the air-warped light, the feeling of being watched, and sounds that seemed to come from nowhere. The first Cyclops appeared, larger than before, its single eye glowing with intelligence and malice. Behind it, shadows shifted unnaturally, suggesting multiple entities, harpies perhaps, or even minor spirits drawn to the Cyclops' psychic presence. Mara immediately began casting binding sigils, creating a lattice of energy between the trees and rocks. Jack arranged mirrors and reflective panels to amplify her spells and distort the line of sight for the creatures. The Cyclops roared, and the forest seemed to respond, twisting the perception of the landscape. Paths disappeared, trees shifted, and unseen forces tried to separate them. Mara's voice cut through the illusions, anchoring them with chants that forced the Cyclops to confront its own reflection in the mirrored network. Suddenly, a shriek split the air. Harpies, drawn to the Cyclops' energy, swooped from the treetops. Their song infiltrated the mind, and Jack struggled to maintain focus. He realized that when multiple mythic creatures act together, their powers overlap, amplifying fear and confusion. Mara adjusted her spells, weaving in protective loops for both of them, while Jack created moving mirror barriers to intercept the harpies' psychic assault. The battle grew chaotic. Trees toppled, rocks slid, and light from the mirrors cut through shadows, forcing the creatures to navigate false images. The Cyclops smashed its club against boulders, harpies screeched and circled, and Jack and Mara moved in sync, each mirror placement and spell timing precise. Mara channeled energy from the forest itself, linking it with the mirrors to create a feedback trap, drawing both Cyclops and Harpies into a zone where their powers would interfere with each other. Hours passed. The feedback loop intensified, amplifying confusion in the creatures while Jack and Mara remained grounded through shared focus. Finally, the Cyclops staggered, the Harpies screeched, and the combined energy forced them to retreat, not destroyed, but contained within the forest's bounds, exhausted. Jack and Mara realized the scale of the threat. Myths were no longer isolated phenomena, they were converging in both power and strategy. Every creature defeated or contained now seemed like a prelude to something larger. Mara said, her voice low but firm, "We've only scratched the surface. Soon, we'll face the old gods themselves or whatever remains of them." Jack surveyed the forest, the broken mirrors, and the fading magic. "Then we prepare," he said, "because the next battle won't be one creature. It'll be all of them. Together, beyond the forest, deep in ruins, and seeing eyes glimmered. Creatures whispered to each other across the winds, the waters, and the mountains. The world of myth was awakening as a coordinated force. And Jack and Mara had no choice but to meet it head-on. Asterisk.